A renewed Ebola outbreak and a sharp increase in coronavirus deaths. African countries are grappling with health crises on different fronts. So how can their healthcare systems cope? And could fair access to COVID-19 vaccines help the continent? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahalbarra. A resurgence of Ebola in Guinea is raising fears of an uncontrolled spread of the disease. It's already been detected in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Neighboring Sierra Leone and Liberia are tracking possible cases. The World Health Organization has asked 6 countries to be on high alert. The crisis comes as many African nations are struggling to contain the coronavirus. Africa is seeing a sharp rise in COVID-19 deaths, and healthcare systems are overstretched. It's feared there could be more fatalities if Ebola is left unchecked. The WHO has shipped more than 11,000 doses of vaccines to help fight the disease in Guinea. South Africa is leading the rise in coronavirus deaths on the continent, accounting for nearly half. A more contagious COVID-19 variant has pushed hospitals to their limits and is spread across other nations. The mutation is feared to reduce the impact of vaccines. South Africa has just switched from AstraZeneca doses to Johnson & Johnson's shots over such concerns. Officials are criticizing the dominance of major pharmaceutical companies over access to COVID-19 vaccines. Its representative at the World Trade Organization says structural change is needed to allow countries to manufacture their own vaccines. The issue of fairer access to vaccine to poor nations has also been raised by the French president. Emmanuel Macron has urged European nations and the US to hand 5% of their current COVID-19 vaccine supplies to developing countries in Africa. Macron's comments came after the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres denounced the uneven distribution of COVID-19 shots.
We must respond to what is a moral duty and to this situation of glaring inequality, and to do so out of conviction and solidarity, as President Ramaphosa has said, but also, if I may say so, out of interest. Because if we do not eradicate this virus from the entire globe through an appropriate vaccination strategy and let it thrive on the African continent and elsewhere in the poorest countries, and to continue to circulate, to make variants, and probably variants that will end up being resistant to the vaccines now being deployed in Europe, the United States and the Middle East.
Let's have a look at other African nations that have started to roll out vaccines. Zimbabwe is using the Sinopharm jab that China has distributed to several African countries. The strain that emerged in South Africa is now thought to be dominant there. Senegal has received its first 200,000 doses of the jab from the same company, but there are concerns about the vaccine's efficacy after a study found it produced weaker immune response against the mutation. Deaths across the African continent have reached 100,000. With a contagious variant and limited access to vaccines, many are concerned that figure could get much higher. Let's bring in our guests from Johannesburg. Helen Rees, she is member of the South Africa Ministerial Advisory Committee for COVID and COVID vaccine. From Brazzaville, Dr. Richard Mihigo, coordinator of the Immunization and Vaccine Development Program at the World Health Organization. And from Paris, John Johnson, Vaccination and Epidemic Response Referent at the Doctors Without Borders France. Thank you all for joining us. Helen, your country has stepped in criticizing vaccine inequality globally, but at the same time, we're seeing the same pattern, which is wealthy nations hoarding hundreds of millions of doses, which they won't possibly be using. How do you see this disconnect?
Well, I think the disconnect is obvious, and we just heard President Macron make a statement from France's point of view, they're beginning to understand that and recognizing that from a global health perspective, this makes absolutely no sense at all. The African Union, as you said, then led by President Ramaphosa, have made very strong statements about this. In the 2009 pandemic flu, the African region was the last continent to get any vaccines, and by the time we got vaccines, they were going to be of little use in terms of pandemic prevention. So the whole effort with the African Union, the COVAX facility, the World Health Organization, and now I'm pleased to say many large countries that are both manufacturing vaccines and have these stores of vaccines. I think that we've got to change the dialogue to say that that really has to be the norm. Sharing has to be the norm, and access for poor countries, and particularly in the African region. We've got to change the pattern of distribution that has so far prevailed, which has been extremely limited.
Richard, there's this issue of changing mindsets to be able to convince people that it's about time to share the stockpiles they have. But at the same time, at the current pace, it seems that millions of people in Africa won't be able to get vaccine by the end of this year. How concerned are you about this particular thing?
Well, we are very, very much concerned indeed. And as Professor Ellen Rees have said, the promise of international solidarity has been so far elusive. And we believe that until people in Africa as well are protected and immunized, nobody will be safe everywhere. So I think it's time, it's more than time that for the international and public health perspective, that we understand all that unless people are immunized everywhere, I think nobody will be really safe, even in places where vaccination is currently going on. So it's not only a moral imperative to do the right things, but it just makes public health sense to make sure that vaccines also do reach people in Africa.
This looks like an uphill climb for the African continent, John, because they're underfunded, lagging far behind Western countries. They're having their own political, economic problems. They're tackling COVID, they're overstretched, and now they are faced with a new threat, which is the outbreak of Ebola. You've been working in one of the epicenters of Ebola back in the past. How concerned are you about the new outbreak, which seems to be spreading from Guinea all the way to many other countries in West Africa?
Well, first of all, it's not spreading yet. What we have is a cluster of 7 cases, 3 that were confirmed and 4 that are probable cases. So we haven't confirmed them biologically, but it's assumed that they were cases. So it's not a huge number of cases so far, and it's in Guinea for the moment. However, it is very concerning because we see that this is happening in a city that's the 2nd largest city in Guinea, and it shares a border very close with Liberia and the Côte d'Ivoire. So this is concerning because obviously Ebola is a very mortal disease, and we are taking it very seriously. I think all the international actors have made a very rapid response, both within Guinea and in the neighboring countries, to make sure that we're ready to respond quickly, because the best time to respond to an outbreak is at the beginning, to stop it quickly.
Helen, we've been talking about the inequality gap here when it comes to the access to the vaccine. Let's talk a little bit about South Africa. You have switched from AstraZeneca to Johnson & Johnson because of the reports about the efficacy against the South African variant, and because ultimately with Johnson & Johnson it's just one single dose. As you know, we're learning on a daily basis about this disease, the way it moves forward. Isn't this something that could potentially have an impact on the way we choose the particular kind of vaccine to deal with in the near future?
Yes, and I mean, not only in South Africa, but there are huge global discussions going on, including with the manufacturers and the developers, about how are we going to respond. You've probably read that globally there are variants now occurring all over the world. The force, if you have a strong force of infection, lots of people infected, you're much more likely to get variants emerging. We're also seeing that these variants are starting to move towards each other in terms of the changes in them. So we're probably going to see that certain changes, certain mutations in the virus are an advantage for the virus in terms of spread and in terms of resisting the body's immune system. So we're going to see this convergence of variants probably worldwide. So South Africa is grappling with the variants and thinking about which vaccines to use. Of course, the problem is at the moment for most of the new vaccines, they're brand new. The variant is relatively new as well. So we don't have an awful lot of data on which to judge, is one vaccine going to be better than the other? And there's a very careful discussion going on to say, what can we understand from the laboratory? What can we understand from animal models? And how much clinical data do we need to get to really understand the impact of the variant on how effective the vaccine is going to be? Because clearly we can't keep doing these huge clinical trials every time we get a new variant with every vaccine. It's simply not feasible. So we're trying to find alternative ways to give us a good idea of how effective a vaccine is likely to be as we get these new variants. And so for South Africa, we changed to the Johnson & Johnson because there we do have some clinical data generated from South Africa in a clinical trial earlier on, alongside lab data that suggests that this vaccine will be effective. And that was one of the reasons why we've made that switch.
Richard, when French President Emmanuel Macron said that it's about time for the European countries and the US to set aside something like 5% of their own stockpiles of the vaccines to be distributed among poor nations, do you see those countries responding positively when you know that ultimately every leader would say it's safe to wait until the last citizen in my own country gets the vaccine before I start handing out to the other nations?
Well, I think the announcement by President Macron yesterday, I think is a very good step in the right direction. But we are yet to see what will be the reaction of other high-income countries. We know that today at the G7 meeting, there will be a discussion around the same topic on how a rich country can step in and then start to share some of the doses that they are hoarding, and which at the end of the day will not make sense to keep when we know very well that people in the developing countries are still waiting for the vaccine. And it's important here to mention that and Professor Ellen Rees mentioned this, we tend not to have learned from the past. In 2009, during the H1N1 pandemic, I think we were at the back of the queue to get the vaccine when the disease was not anymore prevalent. And it's for that reason that WHO, working with other partners, launched the COVAX facility, really to make sure that the global solidarity, equity should be at the core for vaccine deployment globally. So we do hope that the announcement that was done by the French president, but hopefully other high-income country, will be translated in concrete action so that we can see indeed the vaccine starting to flow as soon as possible in developing country and in Africa in particular.
John, if you remember back in 2014, 15 and 16, when there were concerns that the Ebola outbreak in West Africa could turn into something dramatic, that's when the international initiative brought about two significant changes. First of all, we had the vaccine, and number two, a stockpile to tackle any future outbreak. Is this something that world leaders could learn from now when they are grappling with COVID-19?
Well, certainly the response to any epidemic shares some similarities. And I think one of the things that we learned during past Ebola outbreaks is that you have to carry out research and science during the epidemic. And just as Helen said earlier, we need to be able to study these vaccines in a way that's both careful and scientific and appropriate and ethical. And at the same time, we need to advance the science as quickly as possible to be able to respond. And so what we saw in the outbreak in West Africa was that they started developing therapeutics and vaccines for Ebola at the same time the outbreak was occurring. And during the outbreaks we saw last year in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we were able to use this vaccine to respond, to reduce the number of cases. And we were also able to use the monoclonal antibodies, the therapies that were developed for Ebola for the first time to treat patients and reduce the mortality. So there's definitely some similarities and there's things we can learn. I think we have a long way to go for Ebola as well as for COVID in terms of how we use these tools, because that's what's important. A vaccine is a vaccine, but the way that it's distributed, the timing, the people that get it, that's the most important thing. And I think this goes into the conversation we've been having about global equity, making sure that it's not just certain areas of the globe that are vaccinated before others, because that won't bring about an epidemic. And in fact, it's just a fractured response. And what we've seen in Ebola responses and other epidemic responses is that any response that's not organized, that's not cohesive, and that's fractured will not succeed.
Helen, in Latin America and Africa, decades of civil wars, corruption, embezzlement, mismanagement of public funds have undermined the chances for those countries to reset their own priorities. And now they woke up to the need to think about ways to put more money into scientific research, have their own platforms, and why not have their own pharmaceutical companies that would be able to sell drugs which are efficient at a reasonable price. In the African continent, with South Africa as one of the leaders, how do you see that happening in the near future?
Well, if we're focusing for the moment on vaccines, a few years ago there was what was called an Addis Declaration, which involved ministers of health, ministers of finance, under the auspices of the African Union, where the ministers said we really want to be able to manufacture our own vaccines. Vaccine manufacturing takes quite a long time to establish. If you're going to produce a vaccine from sort of the square naught, there are other parts of the manufacturing that countries could get into much more quickly. But now I think this is a wake-up call. We've got extraordinarily few sites in the African region that can manufacture vaccines. And the vulnerability of that is now playing out. You can see that in Europe, in the US, in Russia, in China, where they have their own manufacturing sites and they have the science to back up and develop vaccines, that they've been able to rapidly develop vaccines and manufacture them and roll them out and create the data that's required to understand if they work and if they're safe. Because we don't have that, we're sitting waiting, and we're very vulnerable then to the responses of rich countries. I just want to mention one thing, though, I think is really, really important. We mentioned, what post-Ebola, what did we learn? We learned a couple of things. And one of them was that we need to really create different ways of getting vaccines rapidly produced and rapidly out there. And the COVAX facility that we've mentioned already here, the intent of that facility, which has been rapidly put together under the auspices of W.H.O, Gavi, and another group called CEPI, the COVAX facility has got over 190 countries now, including the poorest countries of the world, middle-income countries, and richer countries, big countries. And that is trying to get vaccines from the manufacturers and get money in to support the poorest countries. And it's been it's starting to show real success. And we just heard that they've secured 1.1 billion doses of a vaccine called Novavax, and $4 billion in the last 24 hours from the White House. So that kind of initiative is the kind of thing that we need to see to really fill a gap. But attached to that is a very strong move towards manufacturing.
I'll talk later, a little bit later, more about COVAX. For the time being, Richard, this is exactly what I think you've been trying to do at the WHO, which is basically as a coordinator of the immunization and vaccine development program, looking into ways where these countries could come together and integrate their logistics to be able to manufacture their own vaccines. I've been talking to people in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Africa, and they were basically saying that we should come together as communities, have our own platform. We could do outsourcing with the European pharmaceutical companies, but ultimately, Africa needs to have a sophisticated, state-of-the-art research centers that would pave the way to manufacturing vaccines. And this should happen anytime soon, because we will continue to grapple with the same health issues in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and I hope there will be a before and after COVID-19 in terms of research and development for vaccines in Africa. And I think this has been a big wake-up call, the lack of infrastructure to produce vaccine. But maybe even more importantly, the research and development capacity and platform in country to adjust quite very quickly for the development of a novel product, including vaccines. So I think we have been working in collaboration with many countries now to see how this, and there's been a very strong now push from the government themselves in Africa to make sure that they cannot rely anymore on the outside. Right. And the illustration with the study that was done in South Africa with the new variants, I think we will need to have this capacity established in countries in the region to make sure that when even products that are developed outside are coming to Africa, we can have the capacity to not only conduct those clinical trials, but also to adjust strategy based on the findings done locally. So we do believe that one important element, additional one, is the regulatory pathway that needs to be strengthened in the countries. And we are working quite hard in that area with countries to strengthen their national regulatory authorities in order to be able to permit this type of development to go forward.
We have very few minutes left, but I have many other issues to tackle here. John, COVAX, which is the international coalition which is aiming to provide vaccines for people across the world. Now they have more financial support, but they're hoping to be able to see 2 billion doses delivered by the end of 2021. Do you think that would be possible?
I think I've been surprised this whole pandemic, what's been possible, because last year we were saying we wouldn't see any vaccines come to market before March of 2021. And finally, what we saw was that already at the end of 2020, we had vaccines and we started vaccination. I think the resourcefulness of the scientific community and the people responding to this pandemic is quite impressive. And I will not be surprised if COVAX does succeed. They've been working very hard. They have a good plan, and they have good collaboration with a lot of different countries.
Okay.
And I would like to see it succeed. And I think if they have the financing, they'll be able to do it.
Thank you, Helen. Now, do you see the world being able to vaccinate 70% of its population to be able to say we have the immunity to defeat COVID-19?
Well, a million-dollar question, and I think that really depends on the response, as you just said, of rich countries to both giving vaccines, giving financial support to initiatives such as COVAX and the African Union. But it also depends on countries' own political willingness to be prepared for this. So I would say that if all of those things aligned, I certainly think that we could do it. It would be an extraordinary global achievement if we could.
In less than 30 seconds, Richard, now many companies such as Pfizer are contemplating a third dose, a booster to deal with the new variants. And this is going to put us into a new mindset where we have to think about how to design the trials for the third booster. Is this something that could undermine the chances to get to all the people very soon?
Well, I think it's a bit earlier to say that. I think we still see research going on how to adjust to the new situation, and we will see more of that happening in the future. But I think our objective and intention now is at least to provide the current vaccines, which are showing some very good level of efficacy to as many people as possible. And this is what, by the way, will help to minimize the occurrence of new variants. So if people are left without being vaccinated, we will see the occurrence of new variants.
Thank you.
And that will have impact even in places where vaccination have already occurred.
I think just the fact that we managed to get a vaccine within a year, when usually it takes years and years, it could be just an indication that when we come together, we can really make miracles. Helen, Reese, Richard, Mehigo, John Johnson, I really appreciate your insight. Thank you. Thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Al-Barra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.